Afternoon session of the second day of our summit. We have heard 11 master positions. We have heard 3 panels, different issues on the education of the architect. And now we are in a position where we have heard a very heterogeneous, or let's say it this way, we shared, or we could share all our opinions from such different regions and such different schools in the world, so many positions, and I know it will be a very hard and tough task to conclude, to summarize, but I'm sure our 3 moderators will do their best to give us a clue. So I would like to ask Lukas as the first moderator, and then without further ado, the other 2 moderators to give us a kind of summary of their opinion, of their panels from the last 2 days. Lukas, the floor is yours.
It's a very tricky task, as you might guess. I have the honorable task to be the first one. First of all, what we just learned in the panel before is that turbulence and confrontation is really the essence of discourse, and I think that's why we're here. So even though you would have not thought at the beginning maybe of the panel that it would develop into such an agitated discourse, and we're also aware that such dichotomies don't really exist. However, Henk, thank you very much for really waking all of us up. This is great on the second day. I think we're all right awake now. The interesting things after the last 2 days is I think that we saw as many definitions of architecture and architectural education as there are architects in this room. And this is maybe the power also of this summit here. And as you said in the beginning, Hitoshi, this whole thing started not for you as colleagues to pat each other on the shoulder, but actually to learn from one another and see kind of different approaches in the whole thing. And this is something that is happening here. So it is same. Yes, we're talking about architecture, but it is different in every individual case. What did we do in the first panel, the role of alternative architecture education platforms? I guess we raised a lot of questions, and we also followed the motto of judge a person rather by its questions than its answers, or his answers or her answers. If I would try to sum it up, and I would also all of you ask to step in and engage in this attempt to summarize what was happening, is that education, and it doesn't matter whether it's architectural education or not, is always becoming, it's always a forth-bringing, and is thereby in one way always future-oriented. It's a very transitory process, working with the students. And what we also realized that always in education we're confronted with a lot of contradictions and with a lot of ruptures, whether they're due to historic predecessors or future questions, but they have to in one way or another coexist naturally, and maybe the knowledge that is being conveyed is, apart from the hard facts of the architectural profession, is somewhat liquid knowledge that kind of can adapt to the various and very diverse social and political and cultural backgrounds and circumstances. For the 4 speakers that are on my panel, that was Mark Wickley, Eugene Ast, Tatjana Schneider, and Jono Bennett, there were overlaps and there were different positions. I will try to sum up maybe one position for each one of the speakers to give us a direction, and start with you, Mark, over there, that you had this nice term of a perforated school, or a piece that you wrote towards a perforated school, which is a great metaphor, which understands the school almost like a membrane, and you had the reference of breathing. So there's always happening something on the inside that goes out, and from the outside that comes in. And this is for me maybe the strongest metaphor that remained from your kind of attempt to describe architectural education, that it goes both ways. It's not a one-directional kind of system, but it goes both ways. And it remains very fragile. A membrane is something extremely fragile, and you have to be very careful with that too. And I think this kind of approach also really empowers students to go further. And for you, Eugene, what I kept in mind was a term that you called creative doubt, as almost like an educational methodology, meaning the establishing of a constructive questioning. And I guess this is the key for all education, no? You convey knowledge, you convey wisdom to your students, but basically you have to prepare them for the real world, and the real world is eventually about also being able to find the right questions, to kind of doubt what is there and see, this is maybe one way, but there's other ways too, but how can I creatively translate this as an architect? Was Tatiana? Tatiana is right there. Okay, thank you. Tatiana, I'm extremely grateful for recalling the political consciousness and responsibility of architecture. That should be also a very key question for educating architects. And again, all of these things that we're mentioning, it's not like this is the one solution, this is the other solution. They're all solutions in the same discipline, in the same education. They should all be part of it. But yeah, to see that architecture always is, whether you want it or not, a political act. Architecture always works in a polis. Even the term polis comes actually from the city, you know? So any architect is per se a politician or an urbanist. And also the idea of co-learning, which you stressed, Tatiana, where the classical boundaries between the teacher and the student dissolves. So it's a co-learning process where the teacher learns from the student and the student learns from the teacher, something that was also very strongly argumented for by Mark. And then Jono, as the last in the group, here for me represented the essence or the importance of the applicability of education in real life practice. So the friction between theory and practice, between academia and actually the real life circumstances that we have to confront, or that you have to confront as an architect. So it's tricky. No, it's very hard to sum up this discussion, but I think these were very key points that have been discussed here. And I think what was generally agreed upon amongst all four is, again, that space, or the discussion space, is nothing given or static, but it is historically completely unsteady. So architecture is always forced to examine or re-examine its own protocol. However, I was also thinking last night after I came home, I was okay, how do I sum up what we just discussed? That in retrospect, probably like in every discussion that you have, every conversation, like the most interesting questions were only marginally touched. But I guess that's the rule for any interesting conversation, that you go home and think, I should have asked this, or what about this? And I think the one question that is really key, and we talked about it, but maybe not enough, was the media of discourse. Yeah. So what are the media of discourse? What are these new platforms? And we had actually great examples here. With you, Tatiana, apart from teaching in Sheffield, you started the Spatial Agency, which is an online archive for different forms of architecture, no? And Mark, with the Volume magazine, you basically created or cultivated an intellectual, you called it Wild West, like a free-range conversation that's happening there in the magazine, where there's 3 different partners that all don't really agree, but they work on one topic, and this is the essence. For Jonet, it's definitely the one-to-one critical engagement on a community level with his agency that he used, which is also a media of discourse. So we have an online archive, we have a magazine, and we have an agency that works one-to-one. And Eugene, I recalled one of your terms where you spoke of poetry, basically, which I would see as your media of discourse, where you said like, actually, the most important for me is like the poetic consciousness of the architect, which is more referring to, I guess, poesis in the sense of making, forth-bringing. But these media of discourses is very key to where also I think architectural education goes. We also talked about in the context of kind of old ideas from the 1960s or 70s that have a new relevance again, where maybe even now the media or the social media are actually are there to catch up the ideas that were formulated 40 years ago. So I think this remains one big question that would be great to discuss with all of you together. There's nothing but we could really answer. So to find resume now finally, the summa summarum of what we talked about. I think it's that we have to accept the mystery of the spaces in between that Hans-Jürgen brought into discussion this morning, and maybe quote here again Cedric Price, he was quoted yesterday as well. It's also the mission statement of the spatial agency that sometimes building is not always the best solution to a spatial problem. And this is maybe, for me, my summa summarum of the first panel yesterday. Thank you very much, but I would very much hope that we could expand on this as a group.
As you know, the second panel had to do with interdisciplinary education. And I think although we had diverse people on the panel, maybe I could structure what I saw, the information that came out. I think we looked at what is interdisciplinary education, and what was obvious from the panel is that there is not one model. We threw around words interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary. And so I think the what was not really clear. The different models for interdisciplinary collaboration were also very diverse. And we could see one example where science and neuroscience instigated a collaboration, a very direct collaboration in the artistic field with art and also architecture. And that was truly very disparate disciplines that came together and was project-based. We also saw an example, which perhaps from Hubert was more appropriate for today's panel, that had to do with information and addressing cities. And using different professionals to look at this theme, but also securing funding from the outside and collaborating on a broader scale, not just in academia, but with other institutions. I think in the case of Javier Quintana and IE, which is a unique case of pollination from a business school into architectural education, which led to the idea of communication, led to the idea of how do architects communicate what they do, and the lack sometimes of skills in that area. And of course, Chris talked to us about tools, and tools that are common across professions and across disciplines, that are therefore being used, and not only being used across disciplines, but also changing the nature of the relationships among those. I thought there was a comment from the audience that I thought was especially important, and it had to do with how there can be a negative outcome in some attempts at interdisciplinary collaboration. And the example, which was really, I think, a very poignant example for us to remember, that when students sat around the table with other disciplines, they did not come to this harmonious result, but came to even more conflict and even more accentuating the differences and leading to even greater misunderstanding or the inability to use information and knowledge from other disciplines. So I think in our field of architecture, the how we do this is an issue that certainly needs research. Different models of how to effectively communicate information and knowledge across disciplines is probably something very valuable as we move forward. I think another question that we sort of skirted around is the why. Why should we do this? And I had the feeling in the discussion is there were sort of two reasons. Why is because that's what we do already. I mean, of course, architecture has always been a generalist profession. We are always in touch with other fields. So why should we even be discussing interdisciplinary? Because that's sort of historically what we do. But the other why that I think is really important, that we didn't totally answer, and maybe we can't, is interdisciplinary education, interdisciplinary knowledge and sharing can lead to better architecture. And I don't think we answered this question. I don't know if we're convinced about that or not, but I think that would be the question as we go forward. Does it really lead, and in what cases, to better architecture or better architectural education? At the end of our discussion, it was really interesting for me because the scope of the panel really opened up. And this year, in the third summit, we wanted to keep the questions much more focused than in the second. But they opened up again, just like 2 years ago, and we started talking about accreditation, about what is important in architectural education, what should we leave in, what should we get out. And we talked about the relationship between academia and the profession. So these matters, while they were not supposedly the central issue of the second panel, on one hand, I was surprised, but I just had to smile. Here we are in Segovia all over again, talking about how do we weave this relationship between academia and the profession to move education forward, to be relevant for the profession, but not to be dominated by it. Chris kept reminding us of that tight link between both, and I understood from your comments that you felt that it could be a mutually beneficial one. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of conclusions because I don't think there were a lot. Some of them were probably the same as 2 years ago, which would be that the DNA of our schools is highly different, that the models that we follow in education are very broad, that of course the discipline is changing, and with that, naturally, there is becoming more pollinization and hopefully not colonization, but pollinization from other professions and other disciplines, sometimes direct translation, such as from biology, but other times through tools and methods. My question for summit number 4 would be to find out what do we put in, what do we keep out, and where do we keep our eye in the future. I think that, well, when I think of my role as a curator in the past, I always thought the best skill that you had was to have a good nose to smell what was coming in the future. I think in the case of interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary education, I would say the challenge for summit number 4 is to have a good nose to sniff out what is the important area to keep our eye on, and let's see if in the next symposium we can really center on what we should keep in as the essence of our education and our discipline, what we should get rid of because we don't need to teach it. Students can learn it on their own, they can get it someplace else, or it's just not the most important, and let's stop wasting time. And then where do we put our nose to sniff out the next big thing? Thank you.
Well, I was happy we had the third panel. Most of the times I'm not. It's always nice to kick off, but in the last 2 days I actually was, because all panels leaded up to this debate in that sense, which is, and of course I'm wrong, but that's the good thing of making a summary. You can make it and be a little off. I think it's a lot about the role of academia in its broader sense, the role of an institute or a faculty, the people inside your institute, the role of architecture or design. We cross that boundary a lot, so I think it's a different debate, but some of us were talking about architecture and others about design as they were like from the same family. And the role of leadership. I think, Martha, in your panel very much that was part, and the leadership in different ways, the leadership of the architects in the process of academia as well as in the process of development, so outside. My panel tried actually what was addressed in the first to talk about these platforms, and I very much like Mark's comment on that, and I don't translate them perhaps in the right words, but he said the platform is actually a stage, so that, you know, is an obstruction in itself, so you better perceive it as a dent, and I don't think you said that word, but I use it. That is, it's distinguished on one hand, but it's also blended in. So there is this space where you collaborate. Now, the ways of collaboration, my four panelists talked about consultancy, about research, designers, the Institute of Academia, funding, the issues at stake, social, but they all took a different position in the in-between space between the institute and the real world. So I'm not doing them right, but Xu actually takes the outside world in. And then, well, I must say he could care less after that. So he uses the data, brings it in, and he delivers something, but you know, the meaning of that something is not per se important for the institute. Michael's out there. You know, he takes the whole institute, his students and its faculty, and he's developing the state of Kentucky. So he skipped the in-between. I think Alejandro almost merged. There's no academia, there's no in-between, there's no real world. It's all one at the same box. And I'm uncertain about Anton. So sometimes I had the idea that, you know, he was on all three places, but, you know, he started a year ago, so we have to wait a little, I think. We give him time. In all that, the question in the back of my head was, and what is the meaning of this for education and research, for what we are doing? Because that's why we're here. So what do we take out of it for our curriculum, for our staff and faculty? I mean, do we have to change for the research and the partners we engage with or not engage with, for the way we fund our faculty, or it's getting boring, huh? Yeah, sorry. And I don't know. I don't think we reached that conclusion. So I'm very much looking forward to the final debate, because it's you know, it's stated as the conclusion debate. They will do all the conclusions now. So, you know, our three panels addressed so many questions for that final debate. It's going to be very complex. But I'm still a little worried about, of course we can say we're all different, and that's good. But we also know the issues at stake also differ, and the way we work together also differ. So the outside world, where our students actually work and engage again back in our institutions, is a different world when we were educated. So, and what does that mean actually for institutions? And I think we haven't touched enough upon that question. Do we have to change the vocabulary? Do we have to change the way we are organized? Do we have to change the way the institution stands in society? I don't have an answer to that, but I think that I hope in the final debate we will get some debate on that. And then that's a lot about people in those institutions, more than ever. And in that sense, it's very much about politics. So I was at home again. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience.